By the time the janitor found the basement, the school had been empty of children for years. Dust quilted the hallways, softening the edges of trophy cases and forgotten bulletin boards. The color had drained from the banners that still clung to the rafters like tired ghosts. In the bowels of Lincoln High, where the boiler once rattled like a metal heart, silence pressed on the walls with the intimacy of breath held too long. Fluorescent tubes buzzed faintly, flickering over a corridor that smelled of wet concrete, old paper, and something older still, like a memory left in a jar and forgotten on a windowsill. Detective Michael Garrity stood at the bottom of the stairs, one hand on the rusted railing, listening to the building breathe. Water ticked somewhere in the pipes. The wind touched a loose pane and made it clatter softly, a tooth chattering in a sleeping mouth. The janitor's footsteps retreated up the stairwell, each one a dull echo that stretched and then dissolved into the stale air. When the last footstep faded, Michael was alone with the past. It was a tangible thing here, hanging in the light like dust motes, embedded in the gouges along the hallway lockers, folded into the discolored linoleum. 47 years, and still it felt like the night had never ended. He moved slowly, his shoes whispering against the floor. The beam of his flashlight cut a pale path through the darkness, grazing over discarded desks stacked like broken ribs, a collapsed bulletin board, a chalkboard with faint ghost letters still clinging to it. He could almost hear the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of teenagers on the edge of adulthood, the ring of a bell that would never sound again. Basement been closed off since the 80s, the janitor had said upstairs, voice low as if the building might overhear. After after her.
Sorry.
Lila Mercer, 17, strawberry hair that flared like a match in every yearbook photo, a laugh that people said you could hear halfway across the parking lot. Vanished one October night in 1978 after a homecoming game, leaving behind an empty locker, a half-finished English essay, and a town that learned how to say the word unsolved like a prayer and a curse. Michael knew her name before he ever saw the file. In towns like Fairview, Illinois, certain stories seeped into the groundwater. You drank them without knowing, inheriting tragedies along with the tap water and the local news. At the end of the corridor, a door sagged on its hinges, its window painted over from the inside with a crusted film of something gray. A faded sign above it still read, "Storage." Someone had taped yellowing cardboard over the handle years ago, as if the door itself were a wound that needed bandaging. He reached out, fingertips grazing the old tape. It crumbled beneath his touch, falling away in papery flakes. The silence leaned in closer. There was a heaviness behind the door, not physical but emotional, as if grief had been shut away here and forced to rot quietly in the dark. He pushed the door open. It protested with a long, aching creak that seemed too loud in the narrow hallway. Inside, the air was colder, damp with the smell of mildew and old secrets. His flashlight caught rows of metal shelving, bent and rusted, sagging under the weight of boxes that had collapsed in slow motion over decades. There were old uniforms in tangled heaps, folded banners, yearbooks stacked on their sides like tombstones. A basketball, long deflated, slumped in one corner as if it had exhaled its last breath and never inhaled again. He stepped in, the floor giving a soft crunch under his shoe, shards of glass, a broken picture frame. For a moment he imagined he heard music, far away, tinny, the echo of a 70s ballad played too loud in a gym drenched in colored lights. Laughter, squeaking sneakers, the ghost of a slow dance. But there was only the low buzz of the failing lights, and the steady thrum of his own pulse in his ears. He let the beam of the flashlight drift across the walls, revealing stains, scrawled graffiti eaten away by time, the faint outline of a handprint where someone had once steadied themselves. Every mark belonged to someone who had grown up, moved away, died, forgotten. Everyone except Lila Mercer, who remained here like a question no one had the courage to ask again. Michael swallowed. The dryness in his throat wasn't from the dust. 47 years. The case had been cold longer than he'd been alive. Yet standing here in the belly of the abandoned school, he had the strange sensation that time had simply curled around itself. That the night she disappeared was not behind him but also ahead, waiting for him in the dim, shivering air. He clicked off the flashlight. For a heartbeat, panic tightened around his chest in the sudden blackness. Then his eyes adjusted, and he realized there was still a faint light leaking in under the door and through a crack in the ceiling. In that muted half-dark, the room felt like a memory he had no business entering, someone else's grief, someone else's mistake. The silence seemed to watch him, patient and accusatory. He stood very still, listening, as if the room might finally tell him what it had been holding back all these years. But the truth, he knew, rarely spoke out loud. It sat in corners, it buried itself in objects, it waited in the quiet places where no one wanted to look. And somewhere in here, the beginning of it all was still waiting. 2. Old disappearance resurfaces after discovery of symbolic object. The call had come in the afternoon, when the day was so ordinary it almost felt staged. He'd been at his desk, drowning in fresh tragedies with fresh signatures, domestic calls, a missing boy who turned up at his girlfriend's house, a robbery where the suspect left behind a half-eaten burrito. The old case file sat to one side like an elderly relative in a waiting room, polite and persistent, its brown folder edges fraying with patience. Detective Garrity. The voice on the phone was that of the janitor, Thomas Riley, though he introduced himself as Tom from Lincoln High, as if the building were his surname. I found something. I think it's about that girl, from back then. Lila Mercer, though he didn't say her name. Some names people avoided like mirrors. Now Michael's flashlight swept across the storage room until it landed on a metal shelving unit near the back, warped into a slight lean as if it were bowing under invisible weight. One of the shelves had collapsed, spilling its contents to the floor. Boxes split open, loose papers, a tangle of fabric. And among them, half buried in the dust and reeking of damp cardboard, sat a small object that didn't seem to belong to decay at all. He knelt, joints complaining, and reached out. It was a locket. Oval-shaped brass, its surface etched with a faded pattern of vines that had once been delicate but now looked like veins. Time had tarnished it, darkening the edges, but in the center the metal still caught the light in a tired, stubborn glimmer. The chain was snapped, one end curled like a question mark. He touched it with the back of his knuckle first, as if it might burn. Then he picked it up. It lay in his palm with surprising weight for something so small. "How do you know it's hers?" he had asked Tom when the man stammered through his discovery over the phone. Tom's answer had been a whisper, as though the line might be tapped by ghosts. "'Cause my sister had the same one in high school. Every girl wanted one back then. But this one's got her initials inside. I checked. I didn't mean to, but I checked." Michael's thumb found the tiny clasp on the side. It resisted at first, gummy with age and grime, then gave way with a soft click that seemed unnervingly loud. Inside, behind cracked glass, a photograph had bled itself nearly to nothing. The image was the color of old tea, blurred at the edges, but he could still make out the tilt of a young girl's head, the suggestion of a smile. Her hair was a pale halo around her face. The details refused to sharpen, as if the years themselves were pressing thumbs over her features. On the opposite side, engraved in looping script, L.M. Lila Mercer. The familiar two letters twisted something in his stomach. He'd seen them countless times in the old reports, on the missing poster, on the yearbook caption, on the list of personal effects taken from her locker. LM in blue ink along the margin of a notebook page next to a doodled heart. LM in red ink, circled in a teacher's gradebook. Now the letters gleamed, tiny and intimate, staring up at him from the hollow of his palm. He tried to imagine how it ended up here, cradled in the dust of a forgotten storage room. Had it slipped from her neck in a moment of laughter? Had someone torn it off? Had it been hidden deliberately, a secret pressed into the quiet, trusting the building to keep it? Outside, a gust of wind rattled something loose in the plumbing and made the whole room shiver. He closed the locket, the soft snap giving the sensation of a door shutting somewhere deep inside his chest. The case file flashed in his mind, black and white photographs of a locker door taped shut, the grainy shot of the stadium parking lot where her car was found, keys still in the ignition. Lila's parents standing side by side but not touching, eyes hollowed out by weeks without sleep. The lead detective at the time, Robert Garrity, his father, jaw clenched as he addressed the reporters, promising answers. Promises that never ripened into anything but silence. Michael slipped the locket into a small evidence bag, his fingers moving with automatic precision even as the rest of him felt slightly unmoored. He wrote the date, the location, his initials. His pen shook just enough that the line beneath his name came out crooked. This should have been a small thing, he told himself. An object, a relic. The chances that it would crack open a 47-year-old disappearance were slim, and he knew better than to romanticize scraps of metal. But cold cases weren't really about evidence. Not anymore. They were about the people who had learned to live around the hole, the ones who had grown old without answers. They were about a town that had turned the absence of a girl into a myth and then into a habit. Objects, though, they had a way of resurfacing when time grew impatient. Back upstairs, in the daylight that made everything look less dangerous and more pathetic, Tom had hovered near the door of the squad room, cap twisting in his hands. "You think it means something?" Tom had asked, not quite meeting his eyes. "I don't know yet," Michael had said. It was the closest he could get to the truth. "But it means we look again." He didn't say what else it meant. That the past had just reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. That the name Lila Mercer, which had always been a story, now felt like something sharp enough to cut him. That somewhere in this town, someone had likely felt a tremor in their bones without knowing why, as if the earth had just shifted an inch under a secret they thought was buried for good. In the storage room, he rose slowly, the locket now sealed and sterile in its plastic sleeve. Still, he felt as if it were burning a circle into his pocket. The ceiling above him groaned, the sound of old beams adjusting to old weight. Dust sifted down in the beam of his flashlight like the slow fall of ash. This was how old disappearances returned, not as revelations, not as confessions, but as small, stubborn fragments that refused to stay buried. A tiny oval of brass, a pair of initials, a misplaced memory that someone had forgotten to erase. And yet, as Michael turned toward the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this object was less a clue and more a mirror. That it hadn't been waiting to be discovered at all, but waiting for him specifically, patient and silent, like something that already knew what it would do to him when he picked it up. 3 Investigator shows personal involvement, mixing duty with obsession. The first time Michael saw Lila Mercer's face, he was 8 years old and not supposed to be in his father's study. It was late in the kind of way that made the house feel like a stage after the audience had gone home. The television in the living room hummed softly to itself, showing infomercials to the dark. His mother had gone to bed with a headache. His father's study door stood slightly ajar, light spilling into the hallway like a secret that hadn't been fully shut. He pushed it open just a little and saw the file spread across the desk like the contents of a broken shrine. Photographs, notes, a cassette tape in a plastic bag. His father sat in the chair, elbows on his knees, head bowed as if he were praying to the mess. On the wall behind him, pinned at eye level, was a missing poster. "Have you seen Lila Mercer?" Her eyes followed him when he entered, those frozen, grainy eyes that had been photocopied and stapled to telephone poles all over town. Dreamy and direct at the same time, as if she believed whoever looked at her would understand something important. His father had looked up sharply when he realized Michael was there. For a fleeting second, something raw and unguarded flashed across his face, a mixture of guilt and exhaustion, like someone caught in the act of believing too hard. Then it hardened into the familiar detective's mask. "You're supposed to be in bed," he'd said. "I heard you talking." "I wasn't talking." Michael had wanted to say, "You were. I heard you. I heard your voice, low and frayed, saying a name like it hurt you to pronounce it." Now, decades later, he saw that same poster again, yellowed and brittle, preserved in the case file that lived in a metal cabinet like all the others. He had pulled it out when the locket arrived in the evidence locker, telling himself it was due diligence, just procedure. But as his fingers traced the edge of Lila's photocopied jawline, he knew he was lying to himself. This wasn't just another box to tick. This was an echo that had been shaking the walls of his life since childhood. He set the locket on the table beside the file, the small bag shaped like a punctuation mark at the end of a decades-long sentence. The fluorescent light overhead hummed like a persistent thought. "You could assign this to someone else," his captain had said earlier, half suggestion, half warning. "It's old, Garrity. Locals still remember your old man on this one. Might look cleaner if I step back," Michael had asked. Captain Harris had given him a tight, almost sympathetic smile. "If you keep a little distance. Cold cases are already an emotional tangle. Add family history to that and you're asking for trouble." Trouble, the way he said it made it sound like an inevitability rather than a possibility. "I know where the file lives," Michael replied. "I know who's still around who worked on it the first time, and I know this town. And this town knows you." They'd stared at each other for a long moment, air thick with words neither was willing to commit to. Finally Harris sighed. "Just remember, you're not your father." But that was the problem, wasn't it? Every page he turned in the file carried his father's handwriting. Firm, angular letters, blue ink that had faded to a softer hue but never completely surrendered. Margins full of observations that tried to sound clinical and failed, dipping into speculation, frustration, hope. October 14, 1978. Last confirmed sighting at 10:22 p.m. north exit of Stadium Hallway. Witness, J. Carter, 15. October 15, 1978. Vehicle located at 06:47 a.m. West Lot near maintenance shed. Keys still in ignition. Radio off. Driver seat adjusted for approximate height, 54. October 21, 1978. Search of wooded area north of town inconclusive. No trace. There were more entries like that, filling pages, growing tighter and more clipped as the weeks passed. The tone shifted from confident to brittle to something heavier, resignation disguised as objectivity. Buried among them, circled twice in harsh strokes, was a note dated 3 months into the investigation. No body, no witnesses, no progress. Underneath, in smaller writing, almost as if he hadn't intended anyone to read it. Where did I lose her? Michael stared at that line until the letters blurred. It was not the question of a detective. It was the confession of a man haunted by an absence he could not map. He recognized the sentiment. It thrummed inside him like a tuning fork struck years ago. The locket glinted faintly in its plastic sleeve. He reached for it, bringing it closer to the poster, aligning the faint oval with the shadow of Lila's collarbone in the photograph. He tried to imagine his father doing this, holding the same object, sitting in the same flickering light, asking the same questions. The thought slid under his skin, cold and insistent. This should have been simple division. His father's failures were his father. His job now was to look with fresher eyes, to stitch new lines through old dots. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like inheritance. Every cop had a case that clung to them. A hit and run with no driver. A child who vanished between home and school. A body never identified. They wore these unsolved things quietly, like hidden bones sewn into the lining of their coats. For his father, it had been Lila. For him, though he tried not to admit it, it was becoming Lila too. He hadn't meant to carry her. It had happened gradually. Overheard fragments of adult conversation as a boy, the way his father would go quiet when they drove past the high school, the night he found the study door open and saw how his father looked at the missing poster. And then the whispers around town, even years later. You know, that was Detective Garrity's big one. Never found her, messed him up, they say. Messed him up. His father had retired with a bad back, a drinking problem, and a silence about 1978 that was almost physical. Whenever the name came up, his jaw tightened in a way that changed the shape of his face. Now here Michael was, decades later, with the same name on his badge and the same girl's initials on an evidence tag. Duty, he told himself. Just doing my job. Re-examining an unsolved case because a new piece of evidence surfaced. But the truth crept in around the edges, quiet and insistent. This wasn't just about justice. It was about closing his father's wound. It was about proving that a Garrity could bring her home, even if home was only the word on a report that said RECOVERED instead of missing. He flipped through the photographs again. Locker door, car, stadium exit, Lila in her cheer uniform, Lila outside the diner with friends, Lila's smile hovering on the verge of laughter. Each image seemed to look back at him with a different question. What are you really looking for? Her eyes seemed to ask. Me or him? His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him. A text from Harris. Keep me posted. Don't let this eat you alive. He didn't respond. Instead, he slid the locket into his breast pocket. He told himself it was so he could show it around town, ask if anyone remembered seeing it that night. But as he did it, he felt the weight settle against his chest in a way that was far too intimate, like a hand pressing against his heart to measure its rhythm. He turned off the light in the squad room and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the dark reclaim the desks, the file cabinets, the bulletin boards with their layers of newer crimes. Somewhere between his office and the parking lot, the line between duty and something more fragile began to thin. He felt it as a subtle tilt inside him, like a floor that was no longer level. By the time he reached his car, night had swallowed the small town in a familiar, suffocating quiet. Streetlights cast cones of weak amber over empty sidewalks. The windows of the old Mercer house, 3 blocks away, reflected nothing but darkness. He sat behind the wheel and didn't turn the key. In the silence, he could hear his father's voice from years ago, rough with fatigue and stubbornness. You follow the evidence, not your gut, Mike. Your gut will lie. Evidence doesn't. but as he pressed his fingers briefly over the outline of the locket through his shirt, he wondered which was truly pulling him now. Evidence, or the deep, unspoken need to step into his father's unfinished shadow and somehow, finally, turn it into light. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and last chances. Its lights buzzed the way dying insects beat themselves senseless against windows, and the laminated menus were warped from decades of hands, some trembling, some hurried, some trying hard not to remember the people they once were. This place hadn't changed since Lila Mercer disappeared. Maybe that was why people still came. Some wounds refuse to heal, but they do learn to sit quietly in public. Michael slid into a booth by the far window. The vinyl seat sighed as if burdened by old conversations. The waitress, Janice, who had been here long enough for her name tag to lose a letter, approached with a pot of coffee clutched like a ritual object. "Haven't seen you in here much lately," she murmured, eyes scanning him the way people look at a storm cloud deciding where to break. "I've been busy." The word tasted insufficient. She poured the coffee, her expression softening only slightly. "Heard about the school. Heard you found something." Of course she had. This town passed information like inherited guilt. He didn't answer. Instead, he watched the window's reflection, the blurred neon sign painting him in a weak red glow, the shapes of other patrons hunched over tables, the way his face looked slightly older than he felt. Silence grew between them until Janice set the pot down and lowered her voice. "You talked to Helen yet?" Michael's jaw tightened. Helen Mercer, Lila's mother, the woman who had aged in slow spirals after 1978, wrinkles folding inward like collapsing time, voice shrinking, eyes hollowing out until even sunlight seemed to pass right through her. He hadn't visited her yet, not since the night she called the station 5 years earlier, asking if there had been any movement, as if the case were a stubborn limb needing physical therapy. "She deserves to know," Janice whispered, "whatever you found." He nodded, but the movement felt mechanical. Across the diner, an elderly man watched them. His clothes, worn plaid shirt and faded jeans, said he belonged here. His eyes said he didn't belong anywhere anymore. The moment Michael looked back at him, the man dropped his gaze to his plate. James Carter, the last person to see Lila alive. He had been 15 then, a quiet boy who claimed he saw her leaving the stadium alone. Over the years, he'd repeated the story so often it calcified into something he could recite without blinking. But something in his shoulders, always bowed, always defensive, hinted at something unspoken. Michael approached him quietly. "James." The man flinched, as though someone had pressed a match to his spine. He looked up with red-rimmed eyes that had seen too many versions of the same nightmare. "Detective Garrity," he said, though his voice cracked around the title. "I heard they're reopening her case." "We're reviewing," Michael said. Not a lie, but not an escape either. James picked at the crumbs on his plate. "People always think I know more than I said, that I'm hiding something." "Are you?" James swallowed so hard the tendon in his throat jumped. "No, but not knowing, that's worse. It sticks to you, turns you into someone you weren't supposed to be." Michael understood, more than he wanted to admit. Before he could ask more, the door chimed and a new presence entered, a gust of cold air paired with the heavy tread of boots. Sheriff Holt, retired, now older but not softer. His beard had thinned to white bristles, and his once commanding frame had wilted into stooped stubbornness. He approached without invitation. "Heard you're stirring ghosts, Garrity." Michael stiffened. "It's procedure." "No," Holt said, leaning in, voice like gravel dragged across stone. "It's obsession, just like your father." The words hit like a slap, though they weren't new. Holt leaned closer, breath thick with whiskey. Whatever you think you're going to find, the truth isn't always a gift. He walked away, leaving the air colder, the light dimmer. Janice returned, setting a slice of pie in front of him he hadn't ordered. "On the house," she whispered. "You look like you need it." He didn't touch it. Instead, he stared out the window, watching snow begin to fall, hesitant flakes drifting like ash. And as he watched, his own reflection shifted, darkened, until for a moment it looked like another face behind him. A girl. For one impossible second, it was Lila, hair a halo of pale static, eyes soft but far too knowing, watching him with the familiarity of someone who had lived inside his mind long before he ever knew her name. He blinked, the reflection dissipated. Just exhaustion, he told himself. But the deeper truth whispered beneath it. He was already too far inside the case to step back. And everyone connected to Lila, James, Janice, Helen, seemed to orbit the unresolved tragedy as though gravity still pulled them toward the night she vanished. They were fragments of a broken constellation, and somehow he was part of it now, caught in the same impossible orbit. He felt the weight of the locket against his chest. It was no longer just evidence. It was a pulse. 5. Symbolic clues, photos, diary, patterns build intellectual intrigue. It began with the yearbook. On his desk, under the glow of a single lamp, the 1978 Lincoln High Annual sat open like a cracked door. The pages smelled faintly of mold and teenage perfume, the sweetness long since gone bitter. He had flipped through it a dozen times, but tonight it seemed to whisper in a different language, one stitched from memories, omissions, and freeze-frame smiles. Lila's photo stared back at him, head tilted slightly, eyes alight with something unnameable, as if she were aware of the shudder and yet beyond caring. Most people saw beauty. He saw defiance. He traced the margin, where someone had written her name in perfect cursive. Not her handwriting. He had seen samples in the case file. Someone else had written this, admiringly, carefully. The same handwriting appeared in 3 other places, under group photos, next to candid shots, looping around the edges of a page dedicated to the cheer squad. A pattern. A quiet one but insistently present. He flipped to the back of the yearbook. Students had scrawled messages, inside jokes, blessings, promises that hadn't survived the summer. And near the bottom corner, faded nearly to the color of dust, he found it again. You always shine brightest when no one is watching. No signature. A hidden voice. He marked the page, then opened the old diary recovered from her bedroom decades ago. The entries were sparse. Lila had been more interested in living life than archiving it, but some lines felt electric now that he knew the shape of the locket, the loops of the handwriting in the yearbook. Someone keeps leaving things in my locker, jewelry, notes, I don't know who, not sure if I should be flattered or creeped out, leaning toward creeped out. Michael read the words again, then again, they pulsed with new meaning. He opened the evidence box containing items found in her locker. A hair ribbon, a dried flower pressed in wax paper, a folded note written in the same looping script. You're wasting time with boys who don't see you. No signature again. He felt a cold ripple up his spine. The frequency of notes increased in the weeks leading to her disappearance. Their tone shifted from admiration. I like the way you look when you're quiet. To possession. You don't need friends who ignore you. To something darker. You should skip the homecoming game, trust me. Michael leaned back, heart thudding. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone close to her, someone who watched her closely enough to know when she was alone, had been trying to guide her movements. Or control them. He spread the notes across the desk. Their edges curled like old leaves. In the lamplight their shadows overlapped, forming shapes he didn't want to interpret. A knock startled him. Standing at his open office door was Lydia Harper, school librarian back then, now 76, small as a sparrow and twice as watchful. "I heard you were looking at the yearbooks." Her voice was thin but steady. "I thought you might want this." She held out a Polaroid. Its edges were worn as if carried for years in a wallet. He studied it. A hallway, lockers. A shadow stretched long across the floor, and in the top corner, barely visible, a reflection in a trophy case, someone holding the camera. "That was taken the week she vanished," Lydia whispered. "We never knew who took it, but something felt wrong. I could never throw it away." Michael scrutinized the reflection. A shape, a silhouette, gender unclear. But the way the figure held the camera, tight grip, elbows close, spoke of secrecy, not celebration. "Do you think this person was watching her?" he asked. Lydia hesitated. "I think someone was watching all of us." After she left, he laid the Polaroid beside the notes, the diary entries, the yearbook clues. Patterns began threading themselves together, threads he couldn't yet name but could feel tightening around his thoughts. He lifted the locket again, opened it, stared at the blurred photograph. Was the image damaged by time? Or was it deliberately smudged by fingers that didn't want the face preserved? He felt the room tilt slightly, the objects around him seeming to hum with restless expectation. Clues were emerging, symbols of affection twisted into obsession, warnings masquerading as care, shadows that documented more than they revealed. But the deeper he sank into the patterns, the more he realized the clues were not pointing toward a person. They were pointing toward a behavior, a psychology, a reflection. And every time he leaned closer, he caught his own face mirrored faintly in the locket's tarnished surface, distorted, doubled, unfamiliar. 6. Twist questions investigator's perception, blurring truth and delusion. He dreamed of the basement again. Only this time, when he pushed the storage room door open, the shelves were gone. The dust was gone. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, and on it the locket, glowing with a warmth that pulsed like breath. He reached for it. A hand stopped him. His father's. "Not yours," the older Garrity whispered, eyes hollow, voice shaking. "It was never yours." Michael jolted awake, breath ragged, sweat cooling on his skin. The room was dark but not silent. Something hummed, a low, persistent vibration. He turned toward the nightstand. The locket sat there, not in the evidence bag. Open. He stared at it, pulse hammering. He knew he had placed it in the evidence locker hours earlier. Locked, logged, secured. He reached for it with trembling hands. Inside, the photograph looked different. Sharper. Clearer. And the face was no longer Lila's. It was his. His face younger, maybe 8 or 9. The age he was when he'd peeked into his father's study. "No," he whispered. He blinked hard. When he opened his eyes, the photo was blurred again, sepia shadows and nothing more. Not a face, not anything. Sleep deprivation, he told himself, stress, memory tricks. But the unease clung to him as he dressed and drove through Fairview's early morning quiet. The town looked distorted through the windshield wipers, as if observed underwater. He went to the school. He told himself it was because he needed more clarity, more evidence, more grounding. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He wanted the room to explain itself. The basement greeted him with cold air and the faint smell of mildew. He stepped inside the storage room and closed the door behind him. For a moment, it was just a room. Then he saw the chair. The same one from his dream. Sitting exactly where it had been, centered, waiting. He stared at it, breath catching. "No," he whispered. "No, that wasn't." The chair creaked. A draft, he told himself. Old buildings breathed. He approached slowly, unwilling but unable to stop. His flashlight flickered across the floor, revealing footprints, his own, overlaid with smaller, lighter ones. Barefoot. He crouched, tracing one with his fingers. It felt familiar. Too familiar. A sudden noise, metal clattering behind him, made him spin around. His heart hammered against his ribs. He stepped backward, breath sharp, flashlight trembling. The shadows shifted. Something moved. Or nothing moved, and his mind supplied the difference. He forced himself to breathe, to blink, to anchor himself in logic. But logic slid off the walls like condensation. This room wasn't haunted by her. It was haunted by him. By the boy who saw his father drowning in the case. By the man who vowed, without knowing, to finish what could never be finished. By the detective who mistook inheritance for duty. Lila Mercer wasn't calling to him. He had been calling to her, projecting, reaching, imagining patterns where grief had carved hollows. The clues were real, the evidence was real. But the way he saw them was not. He pressed both hands to his face, fingers digging into his temples. He could feel the thin membrane between truth and longing tearing like wet paper. Behind him, the chair creaked again. He turned slowly. And for one impossible, breath-stealing moment, the silhouette of a girl sat there. Head bowed, hair pale in the dim light, hands folded in her lap. "Lila," he whispered. The figure did not move. He stepped closer, closer. When he reached the chair, the air shimmered like heat rising from asphalt. Then the chair was empty. He staggered backward, his vision pulsed, his heartbeat thundered, the walls felt too close. He wasn't losing his mind, he told himself. He was simply standing in a place where time had folded in on itself, trapping emotions like insects in amber. But the truth hit him harder than any apparition. He wasn't solving her case. He was reliving it, absorbing it, becoming tangled in the same net that had taken his father down. And he feared deeply, quietly, that the case was shaping him more than he was shaping it. 7. Ending feels haunting and unresolved. Truth brings no peace. Snow blanketed the town, in a silence so complete it felt ceremonial. The arrest had come that morning, James Carter trembling and hollow, confessing not to murder but to watching, stalking, leaving the notes. He insisted he never touched her, never harmed her. But the evidence mounted in quiet, devastating ways. Handwriting matches, a hidden box of mementos, an old journal where he wrote about protecting her from the world that didn't deserve her. He snapped during questioning, sobbing into his hands. "I told her not to go to the game, I told her. She never listened, she wouldn't listen." It wasn't a confession of violence. It was a confession of obsession. The court would determine the rest. But Fairview had already decided. Closure had been delivered. The story concluded. Yet none of it felt like an ending to Michael. He stood outside the abandoned school hours after the arrest, watching snow settle into the cracked steps like white ash. The building loomed, impatient and empty, holding secrets it had no obligation to share. He clutched the locket in his glove and realized the odd truth. He didn't want to return it to the evidence room. He didn't want to let it go at all. He lifted the lid. Inside, the photograph stared up at him, still blurred, still formless, a ghost of a face that refused to be known. Maybe it had never been meant to be known. He heard footsteps behind him, Harris's voice calling his name, but he didn't turn. The wind swallowed the sound before it reached him. The night pressed close, cold but intimate. He closed the locket gently and slipped it into his coat. Tomorrow he would file reports, write summaries, present findings, give the town what it craved. But peace would not follow, because the truth was not simple, nor was it complete. And deep inside, in the space where instinct met fear, he understood. Lila Mercer was still missing. Not in the world, but in him. Her absence had carved a chamber inside his mind, and the case, solved or not, had sealed its door. He walked away from the school, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow. The wind covered them instantly, erasing his passage as though he had never been there at all. And somewhere behind him, in the darkened windows of the abandoned building, a reflection flickered. A girl watching, still waiting, still unsolved, still haunting him in ways no report could contain. The case was closed, but closure was a myth, and the silence that followed carried the weight of a truth too heavy to name.